Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Vidya Krishnan presenting Phantom Plague, How Tuberculosis Shaped History. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our growing digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our 2022 events calendar is in full swing and in an exciting development for the first time in 2 years. There are actually some in-person events on there too, and of course, plenty of virtual ones as well. Our calendar appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order a copy of The Phantom Plague. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event will include time for your questions. So if you have a question for Vidya at any time during the talk tonight, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get through as many as time allows. This event will have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom that you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption live transcript button on your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past 2 years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Vidya Krishnan is an investigative journalist based in India who has been reporting on medical science for 2 decades. You may be familiar with her award-winning work, which has appeared in The Atlantic, Caravan, the LA Times, The Hindu, and the British Medical Journal, among many others. She was a 2021 Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and her recent reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic in India has been roundly praised. I think it's safe to say that all of us know a lot more about respiratory illnesses and infection control measures than we did 2 years ago, or for those in the audience that study this, we all have more firsthand experience. But as we well know, COVID-19 is only the most recent airborne disease to make its way around the globe. For centuries, tuberculosis has been a global scourge, and while consumption might bring wan Victorians to mind, in this new age of antibiotic resistance, it's still a threat the world over. The Phantom Plague, How Tuberculosis Shaped History, not only looks at the disease's past, but also at how it remains a menace, especially in India, where 1/3 of the world's cases are. In the Wall Street Journal, Kyle Harper writes, "What makes Krishnan's book worth the price of admission is the tableau she paints of the current plague. She writes with authority about the current state of TB globally, especially in her native India, which is the epicenter of the disease today. A 20-year veteran of medical journalism, Krishnan is a powerful storyteller, and her accounts of the frustration, suffering, grief, and resilience are moving. And the New York Times says, Krishnan's writing is clear and compelling, and the book is a worthy read for anyone interested in public health and infectious diseases." And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speaker. The floor is yours, Vidya.
Claire, thank you for that generous introduction. I'm going to read a brief portion from my book, and this portion is from the first chapter, and I'm talking about Dracula, which is what my book opens with. Here goes. It is no coincidence that vampires, like pandemics, seem to come from elsewhere. Dracula was terrifying to urban London because he came from a remote mountainous region of Eastern Europe, alien to most citizens of England's capital metropolis. It's also not by chance that Dracula arrives in late August or September. That was also the season when cholera or bubonic plague had historically struck in Europe. Like all aliens, Dracula faced a strong anti-immigrant sentiment. The Count is associated with a swarm of rats and other creatures carrying filth and disease. The vampire brings a terrifying illness that thins the blood and corrupts the race. The book decries him as emerging from a whirlpool of races, a term Stoker borrows from late Victorian debates when it was used to describe the East End of London, home to a large number of newly arrived Eastern European Jewish migrants who had fled from the pogroms. Their burgeoning numbers, swelling mainly in the slums, were feared to bring moral and physical afflictions to Britain. Vampires had been a part of ancient folklore long before Stoker's novel. English writer John William Polidori's 1819 short story, The Vampire, is often credited with kickstarting the genre, something Stoker may have read as a teenager when he spent hours strolling through the ancient, often illustrated texts of Irish folklore in Dublin's Marsh Library. But in Dracula, he gave the phenomena a twist worthy of the industrial age. Dracula is a Romanian word for son of Dracul, a word that typically means dragon but can also mean devil. Stoker's devil lived in Transylvania and traveled to London via ship and then railroad to reach London before he began ravaging the city. Both the vampire hunters in the novel, John Seward and Abraham Van Helsing, are doctors as well as experts in vampire lore, and they're on a mission to destroy the invader. During this time, medical and literary opinions were often reflections of each other. Dracula is essentially a collection of Victorian era medical anxieties. It was written at a time when outbreaks ravaging British colonial outposts could end up at the doorsteps of the colonizers. The most devastating example of this was the cholera pandemic of 1817, which began in faraway Bengal, India. From India, cholera went to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Africa through trade routes. This is the first of several cholera pandemics to sweep through Asia and Europe during the 19th and the 20th century. The plague that began near Calcutta traveled the world for 20 years, killing hundreds of thousands. The exact death toll is unknown, but some data is preserved and suggests how vast the total number of deaths have been. The British Army alone recorded 10,000 deaths, and the Indonesian island of Java recorded 1 million dead. To readers in London, the devil came from the east, as was customary. Through the period of cholera outbreaks, there were ongoing debates in London about how diseases spread, and Dracula captured it perfectly well when Stoker used blood infections as an integral part of the plot. Um, I will be happy to take questions now.
Excellent. Just bring myself back on screen here. So that's such an interesting section to start out with. And I really liked how you drew in some sort of East-West comparisons, because we think of Dracula very Eastern Europe, you know, everything else, Transylvania and all that. But I know within your book, you look at the East-West thing from a couple of different angles, in particular, how caste and race are alike and dissimilar in how they affect health outcomes, particularly looking at Chicago and Mumbai, and looking at how that caste and race can create health deficits between different castes and different races. Can you speak a little bit about this parallel?
Yeah, I spend my time between the US and India, and it's this weird twilight zone that I'm in where I'm upper caste in my country. But then when I'm in the US, the order changes. And it was a complete privilege to be able to draw this comparison using the literature that is available in the US, because in India, health deficits in minority communities are not as well documented. And that's what I do in the portion that is based in Mumbai. I take the reader into the ghettos of Mumbai, and that kind of sets the stage up for comparison. The comparison I draw is with this brilliant study where the Chicago housing projects and the 1992 riots in LA are both compared with a very specific objective to say that the riots or these injustices are systemic, these are structural. And I kind of wanted to draw this parallel, which I felt was just waiting to be made, and no one had made that yet. Again, I go back between East and West quite a bit in literature as well, and also in my reporting. I will say that it's just become impossible to talk about infectious diseases without talking about race and caste and gender. And I started working on this book 7 years ago. And everything that I was writing has come to pass with the pandemic, where now Black and brown communities and nations don't have access to vaccines. And again, it's the coronavirus is now a vaccine preventable disease for nearly 2.5 years. And that's the kind of comparison that I intend to make by placing these two things far away. But then they are far away but not really, because we just find new names for these systems of discrimination. In the US, it's race. In my country, it's caste. But the bottom line is very calculated injustice, which very predictably falls on very specific minority communities. And I kind of wanted to decenter the story and put the spotlight on the minority communities.
Yeah. It's fascinating. You mentioned that you've been working on this book for 7 years. And obviously when you started, you could not, I mean, well, perhaps you could have, if you're studying infectious disease, predicted a pandemic might occur. But what was it like to be writing about, one global pandemic plague in the midst of another one? And did the current events sort of shape how you were writing about TV, or did you just sort of, how did you navigate that, negotiate that?
Thank you for that question. I will say that in my brain, the first case of coronavirus in India was in January, on 30th of January in 2020, and everything since then is like one long week. It's just a blur. I have been reporting on the pandemic for The Atlantic, for the Caravan magazine, who I write for, while working on the book. And I will say, there was this, I started writing about the book. I live in Goa, and when I started writing about the book, I started reading right from the Justinian plague in the 5th century, and I went plague by plague by plague. So when the coronavirus pandemic hit, I kind of some of the things were already very predictable to me, because that's what history and sociology, my training is again in sociology. And I do look to history for answers. There was this brief period of panic when nothing made sense. But then I will say that nothing that I wrote for my book, I did not have to change the ending. I finished the first draft of this book in May 2019. And it's been through edits. Like the first draft was 90,000 words. The final book is around 70. We had to take portions out, but there were no big surprises, and which is very depressing, I will say. And I will also, it's also, I do feel a lot of, for the first time in a very long time, I've been reporting on infectious diseases for 20 years. It's bread and butter if you're in India. And I am optimistic for the first time, because respiratory diseases have never had this kind of attention before, like you said in the introduction. And again, the NHS was born out of the Great Wars. So there is always scope for us to do things differently if only we listen. And the book, how was it to report on an infectious disease while writing a book about it? Depressing is the short answer. But it was also, I am a reporter in a country where there is a tsunami of misinformation. And again, this is a bizarre parallel between the US and India. There were anti-vaxxers vaccination movements in India for the first time. That's never happened. India is a poor country, but even the poorest of families are very aware that vaccine is how you stop. That's how India stopped polio after India's independence. But we now have an anti-vaxxer movement, and because of the disinformation on social media, so it's been a steep learning curve. I will say I would like for this. It's like living in an assignment that's not ending. Yeah. I'm ready for this assignment to end.
I think we're all pretty ready for the current pandemic to end. But you talk about being hopeful and sort of, you learning a lot of, and the possibility of change in this moment. If you had a magic wand and could have, change one thing, whether it's a public health intervention or a policy or a magic pill, or like, what would you do that you think would make the biggest impact on tuberculosis, today?
I mean, if I had a magic wand, I should never be given a magic wand, but here's my radical fringe idea. If there was one solution for infectious diseases, the basic structural root of the problem, both in India and South Africa, which have the highest rates of TB, uh, I would make it universal healthcare, which is taxpayer funded. So, which is how India controlled its HIV epidemic. South Africa, incidentally, has a high TB burden because of the high HIV burden. So it's an intergenerational cost because when the HIV burden hit, Africa was amongst the last nation to get access to medicines. So what we do now with the medicine has a ripple effect that just goes into the next 20, 30 years. So here's my fringe idea. I will make TB drugs, especially the newer therapies that are locked in patent monopolies, free, by which I don't mean that I will steal it from the pharmaceutical company. There are so many models where African nations, the Asian nations are not asking for charity. They want the pharmaceutical companies to be transparent about the cost of R&D. So the countries can pool in their resources and buy the patent. But that's just not an option available. And again, with COVID, we've now seen we are in month 18 of TRIPS negotiation on intellectual property. And it's really shocking that if we are trying all other ways except for technology transfer. That's what the countries are asking for. So I would do tech transfer and make it free at point, which is the point of care for the patient, where when you are interacting with the health system, that's the only way your race or caste or gender does not play in when the medicines are free. So
fascinating. You just said the word gender. And we talked a little bit about caste and race, how they, have an impact on health outcomes. But one of the things that I you say in the book is that, pandemics are gendered, and, you follow a series of women throughout your book. What do you mean that it's gendered? And why did you choose to exclusively follow women as the story, people that you profiled when you're talking about TB?
well, thank you for that question. I did not intend to start profiling all the protagonists in the book, except for Dracula, are women. And I did not start out with the intention, but then I realized what was happening. I was spending time in the chawls, the slums of Mumbai, which is the equivalent of the 7 cents housing at the peak of the industrialization era in New York. And one of the things, there was this fascinating study by architects and doctors who got together to study in the slums of Mumbai. And they found out that women have a higher burden because men leave at the end of the, during the day, men leave for their jobs, they're out. And Mumbai is by the Arabian Sea, so they have better ventilation, they have access to better air. Whereas women are stuck in these completely tightly packed ghettos in houses which have no windows, and the infectious disease kind of boomerang within families before they kind of springboard out, which is again something we saw at Wuhan. And then the pandemic happened, and India had one of the most brutal lockdowns. And almost immediately, what's happened is Indian women have completely fallen out of the workforce at a scale that's never been witnessed. India is now 75 years into its independence, and this is a huge shock to very hard won gains that women have made. And I genuinely mourn the loss of women from public spaces, because that's also gone. Workspaces has also gone, and India is already a patriarchal, conservative society. And Pandemics are extremely gendered events. And I kind of wanted to, again, this is something I wanted to subvert the idea. It's for the reader to decide. But I did want people to look at what it does to women in particular, because in Asia and Africa, something like infectious disease. So there is a common misconception that if you have TB, you become infertile. So even if you have a curable, preventable disease, I've met so many female patients, their in-laws just send them back because they cannot have children. And I kind of, all of that's in those chapters that is in, again, the book attempts to decenter the conversation to Global South, to a woman in Global South, and within that to a woman from lower caste, like the least common denominator, who I believe health policies, are not directed to at this point.
Yeah, it's so interesting listening to you answer these questions, that you keep bringing up things that are what we know now, what we have seen in the past 2 years of the pandemic, and the fact that you were already seeing them in 2019 when you were writing the book about TB. That's really very interesting. This question sort of ties in a little bit, but because this is a frustrating thing, how, gendered this is. But what is the most frustrating thing that you learned while writing this book? I mean, is it that it's so gendered? Is it the tech transfer problem? Like, is there anything you just sort of made your blood boil as you were doing your research?
Lots of things make my blood boil. I will say that one of the more, at Neiman, I was studying behavior change. And, incidentally, I spent a lot of my time during my Neiman year thinking about it, which essentially fundamentally is a problem of how the global north, which is where all of the superstructures of global health, which is the WHO and Gates Foundation, all of these big organizations that are the global health czars, are based in the global north. And what happens is there's this language of talking about problems as not solvable in developing nations. And the minute you come to a problem with that attitude, it's very complicated. We saw this again. I go into the book about the HIV crisis here, where there was a lot of talk at WHO, no less, about how African nations cannot be trusted with new antiretrovirals because they don't know how to tell the time using a clock. They use the sun to tell it, and they will not then adhere to the treatment, and then there will be resistance, and these drugs then will not work. And essentially implicit in that, and Jennifer Furin at Harvard Med, who spoke at length about this in the book, she says that every time someone says that this problem is not solvable, implicit in that is this question that you are using this language to then not look at the problem as an urgent thing. It's and implicit in that is also the question of your privilege and race and gender and caste and all of those things. And I feel like if people we saw this with Ebola vaccine, the minute there were cases. I was in Seattle when there was a nurse, I believe, who'd flown back, an MSF nurse. And the minute there were a couple of cases, we quickly had vaccines. We arrived at vaccines quickly enough. And TB is a perfect example of it. The TB vaccine is 100 years old, BCG. And coronavirus, which is pretty much the same respiratory disease, almost in every way, scientifically, if you can look at a vaccine for COVID, why are you not looking at one for TB? We have upwards of 14, I believe 21 vaccine candidates for COVID, and we have no vaccines for TB. And what that does is patients with TB are currently being treated with drugs that would not get marketing approval if they came. 1 in 4 patients go deaf. And again, all of this is in the book. I profile patients who go deaf and what they do after. But we have good medicines. We are saving it essentially for rich upper caste people in India, yeah, and global north countries, Western countries. And the poor people are dying, and implicit in this is, why are you okay, poor people dying? That question just has to be answered. Yeah, on that depressing note.
That also make my blood boil. You're talking about global health and sort of the sort of structures and sort of giants of global health in the global north. One for folks in Cambridge and Harvard, a person who we think about when we think about global health is Dr. Paul Farmer, who unfortunately passed away recently. But I know that while you were here working or as part of your Neiman Fellowship, you developed a working relationship with him and you interviewed him a few times. Do you mind sharing a little bit about sort of your last conversation with him? Because I do think it is relevant to our conversation.
Again, thank you for that question. I was fortunate enough that Dr. Palmer took time out just for no reason. At that point, I was just some reporter in India working on something, and he took the time out to comment on India's TB policy. But while we were talking about it, Dr. Farmer extensively spoke to me about what he calls public health Luddite, which also is, just segues from my last answer, where he spoke about, again, talking about health problems in a way that, oh, if, developing nations just listen to us, we will solve their problem for us. And then everything else that they bring up structurally is just not solvable. There are two aspects to it, and both are self-serving to the north. And he kind of spoke about how he was at a TB conference in the early 90s, and he presented a study about drug-resistant bacteria. And he told me that the minute he finished his presentation, someone from WHO came up to him and said, if your presentation is correct, our entire policy is wrong. And Dr. Farmer was, yeah. And this person's response was, but we just had all the material printed out. And that's kind of the example that he was talking about when he said this is public health, Luddite. Because every time you talk about the solutions, the global north, including big philanthropy, looks at charity as a solution, and it's kind of elevated charity to some high principle of justice, which it is not. And Dr. Farmer was of the view that we need a more elegant, more sophisticated conversation and a more elegant solution. And I was just lucky. All of that is in the final sections of the book, my conversation with Dr. Farmer. I just feel so whiplashed by the fact that he's just not around anymore. It is truly a loss of an ally for Black and Brown nations as well.
Yeah. We're starting to get some audience questions, and I'll take a moment also to encourage audience members, please type your questions in the Q&A box. I would love to ask your questions, not just my own, but I will ask a couple from the audience. The first one is, do you have any hope that the current pandemic will improve global approaches to future strains of TB, like the vaccine thing you mentioned, or other infectious diseases?
Yeah. I study, my training is in sociology. I study civil society movements, and the networks, in India's case, we had a devastating second wave, and the networks of people that were built are the same networks that then go on to coalesce to fight for right to health or access to medicines or whatever these conversations are. And I am very optimistic because we've never had such an informed conversation about intellectual property, patent monopolies, the toxic kindness of philanthropy, and of course the how race and caste and gender contribute to infectious diseases. So I actually, as depressing as things are, this is also a time where post-colonial nations are taking a very serious hard look at, again, like India is a perfect example of it. We are not a poor country. We are a rich country with a lot of poor people. And Indian doctors are known around the world. The fact that the second wave happened in India, and I wrote in the Atlantic about it, is a symptom of what I in that column called the moral malnutrition that the rich in India suffer from. And at the core of our health, I really hope, one of the things I hope I'm rambling a bit, but I really hope the reader takes away from the book that global health and access to global health is one unified global conversation, and not, a conversation that has to be had in silos where TB patients are fighting for drugs and cancer patients are fighting for drugs. All of this goes back to how legally uh, we legally manage medicines the same way as refrigerators and iPhones. And we need to have that conversation right now, because again, in the US, I see Bernie Sanders saying something about universal health care, and people are like, oh, what a radical view, when it is the most commonsensical view. So I really hope we kind of, the book allows the reader to think about the language and think about structural injustices that go into the global health order.
Yeah, larger change. That it doesn't just stop with, oh, we cured COVID and it's over. There's so many other things like TB going on. Another audience question, and again, please, folks, get your questions in. What led or like inspired you to begin studying TB? I mean, you've been a medical journalist for 20 years. What was it that made this the topic that you want to write a full-length book about?
Again, this is I don't have a very writerly answer for this. I refuse to commit to the book. The idea for the book began as a long form essay for Caravan magazine, which is one of the last few bastions of free press in India. We currently have an authoritarian government. What I did have is like a bunch of stories and nowhere to tell it. And I'm a freelancer, and I was in Mumbai that time, and I started reporting on it. And I would come every day from my reporting trip and start telling my very rich friends who worked in Bollywood and, over drinks about how bad things are in the ghettos. And eventually I have friends who are really nice, and they basically did an intervention, and they said that you have to stop talking about TV over dinner and you have to start writing a book. And
Good friends.
Why this story? That's how the book came about. The book just forced itself on me. But why TB is in 2016, again, this is chapter 7. Everything that I tell in the book before or after is to be able to tell the story of this teenager. I don't know if you guys have read the book, the Fault in My Stars, but this teenager had extremely drug-resistant TB. And the drug for that is manufactured for Johnson and Johnson in a factory in India at a fraction of a cost. But it's not available to Indian patients. And this teenager went to court. She moved Delhi High Court. And this is 2016. And I was genuinely shocked that the Indian government and the Indian Health Ministry systematically denied her the medicine. And then she died. Her family was devastated because when her family went back, they lived in Bihar. They had come to Delhi to fight this case. Their landlord did not want them to live in the same house because their daughter who had died had TB. The younger sibling was thrown out of school because her classmates did not want to have anything to do with someone whose sister had died of TB. And I still find it very difficult to reconcile that India, which is the pharmacy of the world, India makes medicines for the rest of the world. This is true even for coronavirus vaccines. Just because we are doing that, again, because of patent monopolies. This is why I say that the access to health is a single global conversation, because Indian pharma industry has now become a contract manufacturers for American pharmaceutical companies. And we make the drugs here while people are dying by the thousands here. And in fact, this is also a very frustrating thing that I find disease after disease. This is the same for hepatitis C, it's the same for cancer. And that girl's death will stay with me for a very long time.
Yeah. In that story, you talked about how you were going into the ghetto and meeting people and stories, and you were full of stories that you were telling your friends at dinner, which eventually made it into the book. But is there anything, and you worked on this for 7 years, is there anything that time sort of ended up on the cutting room floor that you sort of didn't quite work in the end to include, but maybe you tell listeners tonight about?
There was this really nice chapter that I don't even know why we took it out. I guess to keep the book not very long, but it was this chapter about the discovery of penicillin, and it was just fascinating because there was World War, and these two doctors had to smuggle the samples in their coat pocket as mold. Um, and it also tied into patents because the person who then discovered the innovator of the vaccine was not the person who eventually patented it, and there were four women who were also part of the team that invented it, and of course none of them got credit.
Of course not.
So maybe it's that chapter is entirely out and cut, and it's sitting somewhere. At some point I'll use it somewhere. there
Yeah.
was there was lots more of Dracula. I'm glad my editor told me to calm down with the uh, empathy for Dracula. So there was I went into the history of the real guy, the Vlad the Impaler, and I just feel very, I mean, he was a very misunderstood character. Of course, he impaled his enemies, but that's very in keeping with medieval violence. And he kind of had this very small, um, uh, what do you call it, empire. Not empire. He had a very small country. It was on one side by being attacked by the Ottoman Empire and by the Christian Europe on the other side. And he was mean because of his circumstances. And my editors were like, "Stop! Don't do that."
Who was, the most interesting person that you talked to during when you were doing your interviews and research?
I will have to say that it was Dr. Farmer. It was. Um, we had a couple of conversations, and they were both very long conversations, longer than we had scheduled. And he was just so, like, his generosity of spirit will. I learned so much just in conversations with him. But I also ended up taking, I'm not religious, but my editor at Caravan, when he heard that I won the Neiman Fellowship, he was like, "You must take a couple of classes at the Divinity School." And I'm Hindu Brahmin. I grew up in a family of priests, but I'm not religious anymore. And he was like, "You cover a fascist government and you need to know religion." And I ended up taking Cornel West's classes. And I don't quote him in the book, but the ethical grounding, there is some, I hope the reader finds some ethical stillness in the book, and all of that is Professor West.
Amazing. I will say, I've been working at the bookstore for a long time, and the only person who got every bookseller to be like, "Ooh, I can't believe you just walked into the store," was Dr. West, always. Real celebrity around Cambridge. Yeah. Wonderful man. And then, this is the first book you've written. You've been writing for a long time, but first book. Was there anything about like the process of having your book published? You talked about you cut some things, you finished a first draft 3 years ago. Like, was there anything that was unexpected about sort of the process of publishing a book for you?
I will. So the book came to. It was such a fun process. I wrote the entire book in a period of. So I'd just been reporting for years, and I didn't know what to do with it, and all of that was inside me, and I wrote it in a 3-month period at one go. And it was like my vomit draft. It was not, for anybody's eyes. But I will now say what the book does. I do long form journalism, how I see the two things. Thank you for this question. It makes me think, and how, say, writing for the Atlantic or Caravan is different from a book is, it just gave me more room to play stylistically, but also I look at journalism and books as serving a different purpose. One is like my reporting tells the temperature on a particular given day and it's breaking news, whereas a book kind of can set the temperature. It's like a thermostat where you can because the global TV, the book has now been out for a little over a month, and everything that I hear from the global TV community is that it gives them a common story, because it's not like the HIV community, which was global and there was ACT UP, and the TB community is really small. And it's so fulfilling an act to do, because there are few things more powerful than a good story. You can't defeat a story. And I like again, journalism in India currently is a very it's a reckless thing to do almost. It's not a free country anymore, almost. So being able to find an American publisher who then nowhere, I worked with Public Affairs, which is a Hachette nonfiction imprint, and not even once did my publishers tell me that, you know, we can't say this, which is a very common everyday thing in Indian newsrooms. So that was very refreshing for me. It was a fun process. I really wish I didn't have a pandemic going on through it.
Agreed. I love that, comparing journalism to being a thermometer and writing a book to being a thermostat. That's really wonderful. There is a question about journalism from one of our audience members, sort of asking, can you speak about your role as a reporter versus playing a role as a policymaker? You know, what role do journalists play in shaping the future of public health? Even if you're taking the temperature of that one moment, is there a role that journalists play in sort of the shaping as well, or is that truly only from the book writing?
No, good reporting can inform. I mean, good reporting has changed. One has to, again, you have to be optimistic to wake up every morning. So, and I want to believe that good reporting on policy can actually inform people to take better decisions. It's not happening right now in my country, but that is the aspiration when, you know, people get into journalism. How can you, with this book again, essentially the book is based on right to information data, which is India's version of FOIA, that's obtained from the government, from Freedom of Information Act. And essentially the core of it is the work of investigative reporting, but it's set in narrative nonfiction format. Why I did that is because I grew up on Arundhati Roy and Salman Rushdie, and it comes with this culture of, you know, Russian doll of Eastern storytelling. So there are stories within stories within stories. I do that, but the core of it, what I would like as a policy level in India as well as at WHO, is to take a hard look at the TB policy, which basically is extremely harsh and inhumane on patients right now, globally and international, regionally. I again I can only hope what my book does. It's just now belongs to the reader, but I will say, yeah, I hope the book gives voice to advocacy groups to then start that elegant conversation that Dr. Farmer was hoping policymakers and affected communities will have. What's happening at this point is minority communities are not at the negotiating table where decisions are being taken. So yeah. Long answer, but yes.
In that answer and in a couple others, you sort of touched on the idea of misinformation and disinformation, especially when it comes to reporting in your country. And I know in the book you talk about this idea of, you know, historical amnesia. Do you want to talk? Can you explain that a little bit for the audience?
This is again something I realized, that if you're living between India and US, and I used to joke in my Neiman years a lot that it could have been any other country but the US. I came there when the previous government was in power, and US again is one of those few lucky countries which had an election midway through the pandemic, and the government had got itself in a ditch, and the next government got it out of that ditch, which has not happened in other countries. And a lot of it is because this is the first pandemic on social media, and the same, the same channels that spread hate. I cover the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, And the same channels, the same organizing tools, which is Facebook and Twitter, became vectors for spreading bad information, are directly related to the rise in anti-vax movements across the world. And it comes back to the fact again that how these social media platforms are governed in the US. There are a couple of litigations where, one in Australia and in the US with Facebook, where the governments are figuring out how to hold social media platforms to account. So I'm watching that space very closely, because for a very long time these organizations have been exported to, again, post-colonial democracies, which are fragile, which don't have the institutional strength that US, Europe has, but with the expectation that legally, that so Facebook doesn't has to just act as a platform and not a publisher, and then the Indian government somehow will have the institutional strength to get Facebook uh, to court and use jurisdiction, and none of this is possible. So again, these are very interesting conversation. I follow big techs, this tsunami of misinformation, which again WHO had to cope with very, very closely. It's been fascinating, and it is a solvable problem, but again, it's a global north problem that directly impacts the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, we have an audience question that it's directly tied into what you just said, and sort of asking, have you seen social media play any positive role in public health crises? Sort of on the flip side, or just no, it's all negative?
I mean, positive is not the word for it, but it breaks my heart that during the darkest hours of that terrible second wave in India, which was April to, I think, June, India just lay prostrate at the mercy of the plague. And I lost so many people. I was reporting, and in Delhi, the families that lived very close to crematoriums had ashes burning, falling on their terraces. And at the darkest time in India's independent history, social media is where communities were finding each other. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but I will never forget how, there was this pattern of an SMS saying, a SOS message saying, we need a bed at this hospital in this city, followed by we need oxygen cylinders, followed by we need wood for funeral pyre or space in crematorium. And it's heartbreaking, but I want to believe that these networks that were formed at this point, um, the only grace in that period were Indian citizens who were helping each other, because our government and health ministry is just completely missing.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. What would you say about the state of health journalism in India? And maybe expand that a little versus health journalism in the US, which the audience might be a little more familiar with.
So a direct contrast between reporting on science and health in India is that it is way more public health, which is which under this government is a lot of don't know cow urine is not going to cure coronavirus kind of reporting.
Yeah.
In the US, in Europe and US and UK, a lot of it is about genome sequencing and clinical trials, and it's far more sciencey. In India, it's very back to basics, that this is the science and you have to wash your hands. And again, it is because we are in this period where we have total historical amnesia about how India defeated polio. It was one of India's only victory, public health victory in our independent existence. So the other difference, I will say, between Indian newsrooms at this point are just gutted. Again, the pandemic has affected the media industry, and Indian newsrooms do not dedicate exclusively. So not all newsrooms have a health desk or a science editor. In fact, I'm one of the rare health editors they're not even a handful, and not even in the vernacular media, which is where it's needed more. And all of that again comes back to how we have how media is funded. We don't have independent media anymore. So there's no criticism. And because of that, there is very little reporting on social justice issues, which is health and education. So yeah.
All right, I think we have time for probably one more question, which is just sort of a little more sort of future looking for you. I know this book has just been published, you are promoting it right now, but have you given any thought to what you would want to write, if you were going to write another book, what you might write about? Or are you, nope, I am like back to being a reporter and that's where I want to live for a while?
I will be reporting for a while. Actually, this month I'm just going to, I also had a big investigation come out for Caravan, which was on the second wave. So for now, all of March, I'm going to be at the beach with a book. And I don't know, there is again in India that we have a very hostile media environment, and there is a lot of reporting to be done on the women and minority communities. So it will be about social justice, but I cannot think of another book right now. It just hurts my brain.
I imagine everyone watching from cold, wet, really gross weather today in Massachusetts is very jealous that you're planning to spend the day on the beach with a book. But we're very glad that you started your day, because for anyone who doesn't know, it's about 5 a.m. or almost 6 a.m. now for Vidya. So we're glad you started a very early morning with us, and we're able to have this conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and I am sure audience members did too. So thank you for this conversation, and thank you for everyone out there, for spending your night with us. I put a link in the chat to purchase The Phantom Plague, and you can also just visit harvard.com to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This is such a pleasure and such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a great night, everyone, and a great day. All right. Goodbye. I'll be safe.
Bye.